Welcome to Higher Hopes, the podcast raising the bar for Australian universities. My name is Ebe Ganon, and I'm here to share conversations that lift our expectations and hold our higher education institutions accountable to the standard of inclusion and accessibility we know they can meet. This week's episode is a little bit different. A while ago, I was invited to join an event hosted by the Disability Innovation Institute of UNSW as a part of their annual Diversity Fest. At this event, we came together to discuss the topic of keeping disability rights on the national agenda in the context of rising international resistance against diversity and inclusion. The DIIU have very kindly agreed for me to share the recording of this event on Higher Hopes so that we can bring this discussion into the higher education context. In a landscape where we have ministerial support and authorising environments for inclusion work in universities, but also experience influence from external factors like policy shifts from the United States around human rights and inclusive practice, it's important to zoom out sometimes to consider what it actually is that we're working towards in higher education equity work, and also the bigger societal context we're situated in. In this episode, you'll hear an introduction from Professor Jackie Leach Scully, DIIU Director and just all-round icon, setting the scene for the event. You'll then hear from Professor Alistair McEwan, former Commissioner on the Disability Royal Commission and a prominent disability community leader. Finally, the bulk of the episode will be a panel discussion between Jackie, Alistair and Supriya Subramani, who is a researcher in ethics from the University of Sydney. The discussion is facilitated by me, and of course I couldn't help but bring in some questions and examples from higher education, so look out for those. We cover everything from far-right white supremacy to the autism and Tylenol media discourse, to the Disability Royal Commission, university diversity strategies, box ticking, advocacy and allyship. Whoever you are, I guarantee there's something in this episode you will find interesting and thought-provoking. As you're listening, I want you to consider if you can see similar dynamics operating in your work at your institution, not just for work and advocacy relating to disability rights, but more broadly in the prioritisation of equity and accessibility in the classroom, in the staff room, and in the meeting room. I've truncated this discussion in parts to fit the format, and if you're keen to watch the entire recording in full, please head over to the DIIU website. And finally, there are some parts of the recording which are a little bit unclear, for which I apologise. As always, you can find the full transcript of the episode at higherhopespod.com. Enjoy.
Welcome everybody to this event within the context of UNSW's 2025 Diversity Festival. And as usual, I want to begin by acknowledging that we're hosting this event from the lands of the Bidjigal people, and welcome those joining us online from other lands with other traditional custodian. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. And we also, as we in our different communities work in our different ways towards gathering and sharing knowledge, we acknowledge the diversity of ways of doing that and the ways that that contributes to the richness of Australian society. I'm Professor Jackie Leach Scully. I'm Director of the Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Institute, because if you're interested in that, you can come and talk to me at the end. But the Institute was interested in discussing this particular topic, diversity under threat, because I think you don't need me to tell you that there's, I think, increasing evidence of a retreat from what many of us would, I believe, called progressive values and the progressive movements of the last couple of decades around diversity and inclusion. And for some of us, at least, who've been around for long enough, a sense of disappointment, disillusionment at seeing some of that progress over the last few decades apparently being whittled away. And I thought it would be interesting for us to have an opportunity to discuss that in the context of disability in particular, but also in the broader context of all forms of diversity. So I am going straight to introduce our keynote speaker, who's Professor Alistair McEwan. He has several paragraphs of bio, but he's reassured me that I can truncate that. But again, that bio shows what an impressive speaker he is. He has extensive experience in disability and human rights and has held a number of senior management and governance roles in government and non-government sector. He served as Australia's Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. He was a commissioner on the Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with disability. And very luckily for us, he has joined us at UNSW just about a year ago to do some work focusing on translating the findings and recommendations of that Royal Commission into the sorts of reforms that can influence life at UNSW and beyond. So please join me in welcoming Alistair.
Thank you, Jackie. And yes, I'm completely reassured. You never quite get used to hearing your bio read out again and again, and you're always wanting to wonder how much more can I add to it, but truncation is fine. Good afternoon, everyone, to you here in the room. It's great to see the turnout, and we know we have many people online. I too acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land on which we are, and I also pay my respect to Aboriginal people, First Nation people who are here with us, both in the room and online. I like to think that I learned and still learn all I need to know about politics, leadership, and how to progress positive social change by watching endlessly, on repeat, episodes from The West Wing. It was the character of Toby Ziegler, White House Communications Director, who said, "The world can move or not by changing some words." This highlights to me the power of communication in leadership. What happens when we see political leaders say things about disabled people that can either harm or progress our fight to keep disability rights on the national agenda? What happens when we don't see political leaders demonstrating the values of human rights, such as equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion? Sadly, I am going to be drawing on real-life examples because the West Wing is as close to perfection as you can get when it comes to ideal examples of progressing human rights. Donald Trump has a history of making derogatory comments about disabled people. I'm going to highlight two. 10 years ago, November 2015 to be precise, Trump mocked a journalist with disability in his election campaign. And I went back to the YouTube clip this morning to check whether the audience was laughing along with him, and yes, they were. They were joining in when he was mocking a disabled person, a journalist from the New York Times, no less. So understandably and rightly, the action resulted in strong condemnation from disability advocates, the media, and it's been listed as one of Trump's most offensive behaviours. And this week, very, very current, Trump claimed that there may be a link between Tylenol, and here it more commonly Panadol, if used during pregnancy, and the increased risk of autism, advising mothers, or expecting mothers rather, not to take Tylenol. He also suggested autism rates have risen dramatically over the past 2 decades, and he also made additional controversial statements, such as implying lower autism prevalence in Amish and Cuban children is because of the low use of Tylenol and vaccine. Quite rightly, they've been outraged, and I was pleased to see the calm and measured response from the Australian Chief Medical Officer and the TGA releasing a media statement. No, there's no scientific basis for that statement. At home, we are relatively fortunate in that we don't generally see the same level of attack on disabled people by our own politicians. We often see them speak positively of disabled people and the need to provide better support and be more inclusive. Of course, it's easy to be cynical about their oft-repeated motherhood phrases such as, "we must do better," "we need to be more inclusive." Sadly, when we hear of yet another, again, preventable death of a disabled person in a group home or hospital. To be cynical, I think, can be justified when we don't see those statements translate into action and positive change. We have also seen our politicians here apologise when they have been negative about disabled people, so taking accountability. You may recall in 2024, Prime Minister Albanese apologised after making a taunt during question time, I think it was, to the opposition, interjecting, he likened it to someone with Tourette syndrome. Rightfully so, there was outrage from disability community members and others, and he came back and apologised. And who recalls former Prime Minister Scott Morrison's blessed comment when he said that he was blessed not to have children with disabilities during a 2022 leaders' debate. He made the comment in response to a question from a mother about the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Again, upsetting, and we never really know how much damage is caused. He apologised, including, as he claimed, contacting Dylan Alcott and trying to explain. Now, when you try to explain why you did something, you still wonder whether it's an actual apology or not. However, he acknowledged it. He acknowledged that what he said was probably not appropriate. A few more examples, please bear with me. Pauline Hanson. She recently called a video about the NDIS. She said it was a scam and a fraud. Unhelpful comment, in my view. And of course, it just continues to fuel the stigma and the negative perception that the wider community have of disabled people. And when I was Disability Discrimination Commissioner, she made some really hurtful comments in 2017 saying that autistic children do not belong in mainstream classrooms and should be in special classrooms where they can get special attention. I'm not going to talk about the word special, but you can understand why I might have some difficulty with it. I don't see myself as special, and I know most disabled people don't. I'm only special, or I think I'm special when I'm watching West Wing. And Hanson said, and I'll quote, "It is no good saying that we have to allow these kids, meaning the autistic kids, to feel good about themselves without considering the impact it was having on other children around them." Other politicians, the media and the disability community and others called for her to apologise, but she wouldn't. She stood by her comments. So in my view, those comments contrasted or really are contradictory to what we see as prevailing current issues in Australia around human rights and what we want for children. So what does this mean for keeping disability rights on the national agenda? It means a few things. We cannot ignore the international, geopolitical and social issues occurring around the world and need to constantly be alert to the dangers and risks of letting those issues continue to bring harm to disabled people. If my understanding and knowledge of what goes on behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. and the White House is drawn only from endlessly watching episodes of The West Wing and hanging on to every word that Press Secretary C.J. Craig said, then I know there are decent and good people there with values that are aligned with human rights, particularly the values of equality. equality and non-discrimination. And I know the disability community in the USA is very active and vocal when it comes to responding to attacks on their own people. Often toxic environments are created by just one person, and it can take time for their negative behaviour to be dealt with, often only years later. We may well say and think, oh well, Trump isn't going to be around forever, the next person will be much better. Therein lies the danger. If we don't keep responding and working with our allies, the toxic culture that Trump is driving could well remain after he is no longer president. This is when it is vital to be aware of where the silent majority stand on issues such as disability rights, and to capture the opportunity to build awareness and knowledge within. It is vital for the disability community in Australia to stand in solidarity with our US disabled friends and colleagues and support them in their responses and actions when under attack. In bringing it closer to home, we have harnessed and maintained opportunities within the political landscape we have here in Australia. While we still have far too few politicians with disability in our parliament, we also have values of decency and fairness. We rarely see our politicians espousing the negativity that we see coming from the White House. We expect our own politicians to be respectful and open-minded when it comes to issues about disabled people. In reflecting on the disability rights movement here in Australia, there are some significant milestones of where we have kept disability on the national agenda. Australia's participation in the drafting of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, despite the initial reluctance of the Australian government to be part of the drafting, during the beginning that changed, and they actively supported disabled people to go to New York and be part of the drafting process. They appointed Rosemary Case, who is now our Disability Discrimination Commissioner, as the NDIU rep on the official government delegation. Graham Innes, then Disability Discrimination Commissioner, was part of that, and many NGO representatives from Australia were a part of that. There was also the Every Australian Counts campaign, early 2010, 2011, 2012, that saw the establishment of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And more recently, the establishment of the Disability Royal Commission. Advocates and their allies fought long and hard to see this. So again, keeping disability rights on the national agenda. In bringing this to a close, I have every confidence that with such an impressive track record, the disability community and their allies here in Australia will continue to respond strongly to keeping disability rights on the national agenda. This includes sustained and focused attention on seeing governments here take meaningful and proactive approaches to implementation of recommendations from the Disability Royal Commission. And in a world of ever-changing challenges and distraction, I'm going to leave the last word to CJ Quigg, who, when she was interrupted by someone with an irrelevant question, said, "Do you mind if I get back to what I was actually talking about? Thanks."
Alistair, thanks for opening up with a really good overview of the state of play here and where we're really at in both national but also international discourses around diversity and inclusion. And I think a really salient point that you made there was around this concept of incrementalism. Every time that we accept something and every time that we think that something's okay, every time we don't speak up, and suggest that we should be doing things differently, we shift ourselves a little bit further away from the goals that we have in and around the disability rights movement. And I've certainly noticed that this week with the discourse around Tylenol and autism. As an autistic person, when I see that discourse happening, what I see is something quite radical going on in the US that then gets brought into an Australian context. And then we have politicians coming out and saying, oh, well, obviously that's not true. We don't have science for it. And, you know, we shouldn't be blaming parents. But still this undercurrent of a disability or autism is the worst possible thing that could be happening to you or your child. And so even though we are suggesting that these comments are radical, that they're not based in evidence, there is still this undercurrent of, you know, disability is something to avoid and something to hide away. And then that slowly is undoing the work that we do in the disability movement. So thank you so much for setting up our panel discussion today. My name's Ebe Ganon. I'm the Board Chair of Children and Young People with Disability Australia and a disability advocate based in Canberra. As of last week, I'm also part of the UNSW community and have started my PhD in disability studies. So very nice to be, very nice to be in a room full of peers and to be joining such a vibrant community of people committed to disability rights and disability studies as well. Over the next hour or so, we are going to be talking to our incredible panellists about this topic. We are going to be using a couple of prepared questions. We'll be sourcing some questions from our online audience, and then in the last 20 minutes or so, we'll hand over to the room, and there will be a roving mic moving around. Alistair needs no introduction, and Professor Jackie Leach Scully, as the Director of the Institute, needs no introduction either, but I would like to introduce Supriya, who is joining our panel today. Supriya Subramani's work at Sydney University critically examines structural injustice, everyday indignities, and the ethics of belonging. Her projects explore how emotions, moral epistemology, and everyday indignities influence one's moral self, and how power is negotiated and challenged by individuals, especially in marginalised and minoritized community, in interpersonal interactions and institutional contexts, particularly in healthcare spaces and communities. And by including Supriya on our panel here, we're really hoping to have a cross-movement conversation around discourse on diversity and inclusion, using disability as a primary example and a launchpad, but also talking more broadly because we know that the disability rights movement intersects with a whole range of other movements. Jackie, I want to ask if you have any immediate reflections on Alistair's presentation from just now that you'd like to kick us off with.
It's really interesting thinking of this in the Australian context. As a Brit, I think you can probably tell I'm not from around here. I came to Australia 6 years ago. Before that, I was in the UK, and I have a lot of professional colleagues in Europe and in Australia. So from them, I'm getting the various messages of how this is playing out in different global contexts. There seems to be a very general retreat or regression from ideals of equality and inclusion and diversity, but they're playing out differently in different places according to the particular histories of places and their particular fears and their particular vulnerabilities, I suppose. So in the US, most of it seems to be concentrated on race, and that's not the case in the UK, where much more of it seems to be around migrants. I know the two overlap, but they're not quite the same. It's not quite playing out like that in Australia either, although obviously what is seen as migrants and aliens and so on are in the news a great deal. In none of these countries is disability really at the fore, and yet in all of them you can see an undercurrent of the ways in which disability rights and inclusion are being nibbled away at in very similar ways, and sometimes not in very subtle ways either. I mean, Alistair mentioned Donald Trump and his very gross and obvious behaviour towards people with disability. In other places it's less crass, but it's still there, and it's there in the language, and it's there in the inadvertent slips that people sometimes make and then apologise for the next day. And it's great that they apologise, but the fact that they made that slip in the first place suggests that there is an underlying issue that needs to be addressed. That's my first comment anyway.
Thanks, Jackie. And I think that kind of intersection that you were talking about there between the way that race and experiences of migrants are perhaps amplified in other jurisdictions, I do see that coming into the way that we look at migration pathways in Australia in the context of disability as well. The Disability Discrimination Act is currently under review, and as some of you might be aware, folk who are coming to Australia through a migration pathway are currently subject to an exemption under the Disability Discrimination Act, where we say that it's okay to refuse people based on their disability status or perhaps the level of support that they might attract. And that, while it doesn't seem so significant or dramatic, is again part of this undercurrent which reinforces these low expectations for people with disability and kind of continues to sanction this idea that we can just sideline this conversation over here. Supriya, I'm wondering if you have any reflections on Alistair's presentation.
Thank you, Ebe. So listening to Jackie and also listening to Alistair's reflections or the talk, for me it just brought in so most of my life I was been in India, and in Australia it's been just 2 years. And then my life was never surrounded by Trump or US, even though it was affected, right? I mean, India, Global South, the back and forth of Global North and Global South discourses, which definitely is at the center. And my reflections immediately as I was listening to Alistair is about how white supremacy it intersects with the fascism, insurgence of fascism, which is growing across, especially in US, and the ways the language has developed further, right? I mean, whether it's in UK or Western Europe, and again, migrants and race. I mean, the things with other, right? Anyone who is an other becomes the target, and the fear which even Jackie was reflecting on. And being in Australia, when I came in 2023 with the referendum discourse was going around, and then comes with March for Australia. And then the language of migration debate, again, when I was looking at how migrants becomes, especially refugees and asylum seekers, one is the way the racism functions, because when you don't even acknowledge the First Nations community of, recognizing the dignity of histories or culture in First Nation communities, the kind of settler colonial discourse which we are in. And then comes the language of other intersecting oppressive identities and categories. And then it's an interlocking system, right? Disability is at the heart. And as I'm learning with scholars around who are from, trans communities, queer, and person of color, Black and Indigenous communities, disabled activists, right? Disabled scholars, activists. The center is much more of liberation, and what it needs to happen is the collective looking at how these interlocking systems are understood or needs to be understood, and that's what I was understanding as I was reflecting and listening to you. I think that's my initial thought on how do we understand the larger geopolitics discourses, but also the ripple effect, which we think is it's kind of exporting from US to here, but I think it's not exporting, it's the breeding ground is already there, right? And then it's more of reflection, critically looking at what we are doing in different contexts, whether it's in India, Brahminical supremacy goes, Hindu fundamentalist goes again to targeting the other in different ways, and people who are already marginalized and with multiple marginalization and identities becomes the target and becomes much more oppressed in these systems. Yeah.
Those multiple layers of marginalization is really interesting, and in the Australian context, the way that our discrimination law works, we've got all of these different discrimination acts that are separate. We've got our Disability Discrimination Act, we've got our Sex Discrimination Act. I know one of the recommendations of the Royal Commission, Alistair, was around looking at a broader Human Rights Act. Where do you think that conversation is up to now? And do you see this broader conversation about the threat to diversity coming into that?
Yes, so when we look at what we have currently, the Disability Discrimination Act is based on some of the principles of human rights, such as equality and non-discrimination, as I spoke about earlier. It doesn't still capture the changes we want to see broadly through social change, applying the social model of disability, because it naturally focuses just on discrimination. So it's very much based on an individual act. Even though there are standards, they also should be applying to both individuals and organisations, but what we're not seeing is an all-encompassing human rights act. The Disability Royal Commission recommended a Disability Rights Act. Arguably, we didn't know if we were going outside our terms of reference by recommending a Human Rights Act. However, the fundamental thing we want to see is domestic implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It leading best practice. It encompasses the social model. Yes, so to be honest, I don't care how we implement the UN Convention, whether it's a standalone Disability Rights Act or a broader Human Rights Act. The concern I have with the broader Human Rights Act conversation is we might lose some of the specific things that we want held on to. Naturally, this occurs when you're trying to bring everybody into the same tent. However, we've seen other countries enact Human Rights Act and with varying degrees of success. So fundamentally, we need a framework where we can point to it and then keep having that conversation. So the current legislative framework doesn't allow that.
Jackie, in the research community that you work in, do you see this broader global and national influence in a conversation around the role of diversity and inclusion shifting the way research is being undertaken or conversations that are happening?
To an extent. I think there's, over the last few years, there's been an odd phenomenon in which is that with the best intentions, a lot of the original drive and motivation for wanting good things like diversity and inclusion got subsumed under a kind of, I was going to call it acronymization. And what I mean by that is that we started talking about EDI and DEI in the US and so on. And in some ways I think that was a good thing because it felt like it was becoming part of the language and was being embedded. But in retrospect, I think one of the things that it did was drain some of the passion out of it, because it's really hard to get excited and passionate about, we want EDI, now. You can do that with the fundamental values that are driving it, which are about, fairness and justice, equality. These are all really powerful and resonant words, and I think they touch people's hearts and motivate them. EDI is also something that becomes so anonymized in a way that it's easy to make a sort of monster of it. So for those people who are ambivalent or actively hostile towards equality, towards inclusion, you just start bandying that acronym around, and it's easy to make it sound like, the NSA or the FBI or something like that. It just becomes something that's easy to be a target. And that, I think, is what's happened in some of the areas that I've been looking at, that what we need perhaps is to step back a little bit and perhaps even relinquish that acronym and start talking more about the fundamentals of fairness and justice, compassion, equality, and so on, to bring some of that life back into it. Because nobody really is going to say, I'm against fairness, I'm against justice. But they might say, I'm against EDI because I associate it with wokeness or whatever, and therefore I don't like it.
It's really interesting. I certainly see some of those conversations happening in the depths of niche LinkedIn groups full of DEI practitioners. Yeah. I find it very interesting that it's an acronym that, particularly in the US, but more so increasingly throughout the rest of the world, has been accepted as something that we've sanitized enough to adopt into corporate culture. And I think it really digs at the heart of what started a lot of these movements in the first place, which were radical acts of resistance from movements like the disability rights movement, from the feminist movement, from a whole range of different parts of society that had historically been silenced. And by contracting it into this acronym, as you've suggested there, what have we lost there? Supriya, I'm interested in just, like, do you see this happening in your work? Are there aspects of, maybe we can call it like DEI discourse or DEI culture, that have started to sanitize the kinds of actions that you see in your work?
Right. So what I've noticed, again, over moving in and out of Europe and in Australia here, and in India is, again, the conversations of caste, like in affirmative actions, anything around, thinking around the questions of equity and justice. But DI has become, as even Jackie said, and even the way you pitch it, it's like it gets appropriated in certain culture, especially within the institutions. So now I'm like very scared of, or like I'm very skeptical the moment the institution just embraces and uses a word. I'm like, should I not trust this? What are they going to do with that, right? So now belonging is something which I was holding dear to, but then the institutions have kind of used it. Now they want to measure it, and then I'm like, okay, now I want to step back and think through. So that goes to the question of diversity for me. The language of diversity has become so tokenistic in many ways. One is the research-wise, but also within the workplace environment, right? You want to bring diverse communities or a diverse group of people, but you don't change the structure. So what does it do then? It doesn't do anything, right? I mean, if the language of justice is at the heart of DEI, if that's what I would believe, that if it needs to do something, it needs to have a teeth, then we need to focus on structure and the structural ways of functioning. So structural injustice is where we need to address and tackle. But because, as you rightly pointed out, as also Jackie said, it gets appropriated because institutions don't want to do anything about it, right? So we have nice policies, we have nice documents, we have all the nice postures to celebrate diversity. We need only language. I mean, this is something with migration health discourse, which comes very often. So far, you bring good food. So far, you bring good language. It's all the tick boxes, right? But that's enough of the difference we would want to value within the larger institution culture. I think this goes with the other discourses, right? Like how much is enough of you and not your true self. I think that's something is what I would see within the way we think and the way I embody myself in these white dominant spaces of what diversity work can do and it's not doing in itself. And again, scholars who have been or engaging much more within the institutional practice are well aware of what it doesn't do and what it claims to do.
Yeah. Before I move us to starting to think about what we can do about this and kind of the solutions, what we can do, I'm interested if there are any perspectives specific to how we're seeing this in higher education, particularly given the context that we're in here. You know, universities are really good at producing beautiful, shiny strategies and, you know, lovely documents, lovely videos about our attitudes around diversity and inclusion and our organisational values. And those things are important. They set a standard for when people enter the institution. But then you want to see what's behind that, right? And you want to see what the organisation is doing structurally and culturally, not just in a marketing sense. Jackie or Alistair, do you have any reflections on the higher education context?
Yes, but possibly not in the direction you're going, but maybe we can come back to that.
You tell me.
I think one thing I would want to say is that the universities are a very, very privileged community. They're a very protected community, and those who, on the whole, and those who live and work within them or study within them can, I think, sometimes get a very, very comfortable view of what real life is like for a lot of people outside this particular environment. It's not always protected or comfortable, but in this context, I think it may well be. And I think we need to, we can't kind of abandon that, you know, it's good that it's there, but we can use that as an opportunity to say, well, this is a fairly safe place to be. Let's have a close look at some of those concepts that we are using. Because I think just like you're talking about the corporatization and so on of that language. At UNSW, I have had a couple of occasions when I've just decided to act as sort of devil's advocate and, you know, ask people, inclusion, why is it good? And people struggle to answer. You know, they know that it's good, but they can't always say why. And I think that's a problem, because I think it's good. But we need to be able to articulate that and make an argument for ourselves, let alone to the world outside. So I think we ought to maybe focus a little bit more on equipping people for understanding why we hold these values, as well as making sure that they've done the Moodle and they've got 90% all the way through, and therefore they've passed that particular training element.
Anything to add, Alistair?
The issue of when you, as Jackie talked about, when you have conversations with people about inclusion and language, and this happened in the Disability Royal Commission, and I'm not going to go too much into the weed or behind the scenes. However, when you look at the final report, the use of the word, for example, segregation. Now, segregation had a very strong history among the black community in America who, talked about the segregation of white from black. The disability rights movement also picked it up decades ago. There were commissioners, not myself obviously, who were uncomfortable with that word and attempted to either sanitize it or not, and I'm being frank here, not wanted to deal with the discomfort that what we were trying to achieve. And sometimes we get so caught up in the use of language, we forget what we're trying to actually achieve. We were trying to achieve, well, one thing, to stop disabled people from dying in safe homes. Yes, they're segregated. If you're uncomfortable with that word, try and reflect on, well, what are we trying to achieve here? So I think when I see attempt to sanitize, please do not get me started on the word disability and how others want to adapt it to remove the word itself. So we now have Inclusive Employment Australia, the old Disability Employment Services. We now have, I'll get off my soapbox, but when I see people try to move away from what is being quite rightly held with pride by the disability community, I'm disabled and I'm proud, get over it. So be alert to the dangers of when a wider section of the community tries to sanitize things because they're uncomfortable. That's the challenge that we need to keep addressing. Anyway, I said I have a lot to say. I will pause.
But I think you raise a really important point there, and certainly some of that sanitisation actually comes from people who are allies to our community as well, or people who align themselves with our movement or align themselves with the discourse of DEI. I don't know if you've got a disability reference group or employee group at UNSW. I see a lot of them being called ability networks, and I find that quite euphemistic. Why can't we say disability, and why can't we be proud of that word? But I'm thinking about what you were saying, Jackie, around we need to be able to bring people along on this journey, and a lot of the concepts and the discourse that we use when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and accessibility can be impenetrable for some people, or people who haven't been exposed to disability lived experience in their life, people who've grown up in communities surrounded by people who are much like themselves. And in the context of diversity being under threat, I see this in a few different categories. We've got the people who are working alongside us. We've got the people who understand. We've got our undecideds in the middle. And then we've got our active detractors on the other side. I'm wondering, Supriya, in your work, you were talking about, you mentioned breeding grounds for this kind of anti-diversity rhetoric and, some of this white supremacy rhetoric that we're seeing rising, not just in the US, but here in Australia as well. What role for intervention is there? Like, what do you think we could be doing there to stop this cycle?
This is like a huge question, right?
Let's unpack it. We'll do it together.
Right. So within my workspace, like when I'm very focused within the questions of anti-caste, especially in India, or when I focus on the upper caste and upper class discourse, or in Australia very recently, I'm engaging with mental health professionals within African communities. So there, the language of racism in itself, first, like, people who experience racism, and especially migrant communities sometimes, again, migrant communities are so heterogeneous, right? And I feel like there's one way I think in my own work is like how migrant communities, especially if I think about certain migrant communities who are well off or relatively better off, how do we work and collaborate and stand in solidarity with First Nation communities and understand and reflect on the struggles which is already ongoing and be part of that. And then there is another whole layers of different kind of marginalized communities and discourses which is happening and learning from each other. That, the collective liberation movements, like it happens at different bubbles, and I think we need to learn from each other. That's not happening enough. I think we were talking this before, right? So it's like each one wants to be at the comfort zones of wherever you're familiar with and what kind of your identities are with, but we are not expanding and learning from each other. I think that's something we need to do more and more across, I feel. The other is like targeting. That's one of the whole things. I mean, if a person is called, let's say, racist or white supremacist, how do you want to have a conversation with them? How do you want to so-called bring a social change within the larger society? It's a big task and it takes time, right? I mean, again, I was recently watching Adolescence, the discourse within the whole, the ideas of toxic masculinity and the incel culture. How do we bring in change? And then that feeds into the whole language of justice, I believe. The reason is like you need to look at everything, but in order to do that, it's a massive job. That means the interdependence, that what disabilities justice scholars have been talking about is like looking at this and learning from each other and then taking us one step at a time to reflect and learn. I think that something is important. But again, I can't answer that question. It's a huge one.
No, it's really interesting. Like in Australia, we love to batch everyone who diverges from the white Australian norm into other, right? Like whenever we look at the way that we count people, the way that we fill out forms, the way that we do workplace or educational inclusion. In universities, we batch all of the equity groups together. And there's so much diversity within those groups and also within the micro-communities within them. But at the same time, when we do collectivise and when we use that cross-movement solidarity to learn from each other and to work towards similar goals like combating toxic discourse around inclusion and diversity, we do get really strong outcomes. Jackie, I'm keen to hear what you think some of the approaches we could use in bringing some of those people that you mentioned before along the way. Like, how do we make sure that people can answer the question, why is inclusion important?
I think we need to open the discussions at a very basic level. And in part, as you said, there's that sense of using a language with which people outside our own little bubble are not particularly familiar. We can make assumptions about ways that they understand particular concepts as well. We should be open to the possibility that we're going to engage in a discussion and with, let's say, somebody who you might otherwise not wish to have a discussion, and come out of it with a slightly changed opinion. Because if you just go in thinking, I'm going to tell them the truth, that's not a real engagement, and that's not a proper conversation. And that is difficult. I've sat in rooms with people telling me that, I don't know, as a disabled person, I cost everybody money. I feel like showing them my tax return when that happens. That I ought not to be taking up the job of a normal person, et cetera, et cetera. And that's actually difficult to sit and hear. But I try to understand where that is coming from, that a lot of it is to do with unfamiliarity, sometimes bravado, sometimes it's fear, all that kind of thing. I think that disability, if I may just say, I think disability is unlike some of the other equity cohorts or marginalised groups, however we want to talk about them, because there's still an underlying huge ambivalence about disability. I think you would have to be very, very extreme racist to say the world would be better off if there were only white people. You'd have to be not at all committed to the survival of the human race if you were to say the world would be better off without women. That's a kind of non-starter. But it's a much greyer discussion if you say the world would be better off if there weren't disabilities. And that's not because I'm saying I think the world would be better off without disability, but our language doesn't allow us to do a sort of nuance around that and to really look very clearly at the fact that we call it disability because there's something negative about the experience of people in that category. And that negativity may be entirely due to society's responses and so on. But we still have to deal with the fact that a lot of people, you saw this covertly sometimes overtly during COVID, when we were being told about how it was only people with underlying conditions underlying health conditions who were dying, which is not true, but we were told that. And there was sometimes an underlying sense, sometimes an explicit sense of, and that's not such a bad thing, is it? Because the weakest were being got rid of. I think that attitude is still there much more than we're willing to admit, and sometimes that needs to be really tackled, sort of head on. Which is deeply uncomfortable, particularly if you're the person embodying that particular marginality and you're engaged in that. But I think we can do it. And if we do it, and we can then say things like, well, actually, I don't cost anybody any money, or whatever the truth is, I think that would be useful.
I want to pick up on what Jackie was saying about how disability still seen very much in that grey area of when we talk about being, the collective approach. I'm going to channel Stella Young, the immortal Stella Young, and paraphrase when I say, with the establishment of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we've been sold a lie. We've been lied to. Now, let me clarify. When it was established for the right reason of providing support to those with high or complex or significant support needs to be more independent or to be able to participate in the wider community. So Article 16 of the Convention, to be precise. But then politicians, media and the wider community assumed that the National Disability Insurance Scheme was there to fix every single disability problem in Australia, and it was never intended for that. So we've been sold a lie, I'm sorry to say. We need to remind ourselves, and this is, again, the wider community are comfortable because, you've got the NDIS. You have a disability? Go to the NDIS. You're going to the airport and you need support to go to security, where's your NDIS support worker? You go to school, where's your speech pathologist? The list goes on. Mainstream settings are failing many disabled people. So Jackie, when she talked about that collective approach, disability is still put over there, and yet many people think it's also because of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And I'll conclude by saying, it has, however, been life-changing for those who are on it and who rightly, deservedly are on it. However, we now have a huge problem with trying to make sure that the money we're spending is going in the right direction. So again, it comes back to the point about non-disabled people feel comfortable because, tick a box, NDIS, off you go, not willing to engage in the uncomfortable conversations that Jackie mentioned, including during COVID.
I think media plays a really big role in that as well, in characterising the NDIS in a particular way, right? We're always talking about the NDIS on a cost basis. It's a huge line item in the budget. We're spending so much money. But then the next news story in the bulletin is about how many jobs AUKUS is going to be creating. And when we have so much data about the huge multiplier effect of NDIS spending, it is this toxic discourse around diversity and inclusion that is kind of behind that, right? It's saying that we are directing money to individuals and we're selecting those based on an identity or a physical category, and that's not fair. Therefore, we characterise it as a cost as opposed to characterising it as the massive contributor, not only to our economy, but also the moral imperative of looking after everyone. And I think that the media plays a big role in shaping the views of those undecideds in the middle. Supriya, I'm wondering how you feel what about those undecideds, the people who can be swayed either way? How can we be working towards shifting their perspectives more towards inclusivity and supporting the full diversity of our community?
Right. Again, the whole way. I don't know how to fix many things, but then it's a moment of reflection and to pause. I think it's about like how the ableist way of functioning, right, in the society we are, and then which comes in hand along with capitalist economy we are, which feeds into this too, right? Because the more you look at the person's value from the productive, the labor and the productive aspect, which again is like you need to make up the language for where this goes, the channeling of where the money goes and the conversation of tax or how each person deserves or not. Again, I don't have that answer for that, but I think it's where more of intersecting oppressive systems needs to be understood closely, because very often, I mean, this is my understanding, is disability we can't just be taking away without looking at the larger oppressive systems, whether it's sexism or whether it's we are looking at the ableist way of functioning and then heteronormative and patriarchal systems which we are part of. I mean, these are the big words, but then this is the interlocking system we are sitting with, right? And a person who is living with disability, it's not just that one identity. So that means we need to look at what that sustains in itself the loop of oppressive experiences. How do we undo it? And I think again, my answer, what I was talking about is going back to how do we address structural injustice? And I think at the heart is the justice question which we need to look at. So diversity you can't do without justice. I mean, if you want to do authentically understand and reflect on diversity, we can't do without justice, I believe.
From your work and your research, do you have a sense of how we can raise the critical consciousness of people in relation to those systems?
So my learning or unlearning over the years recently has been much more of people are already doing it really well. What I mean by that is like when I engage with communities, there is so much of resistance and we need to learn more from people how they're resisting already. I think that's something which is what I might take away. What are the learnings? It depends on different communities where they're doing and how they're doing it and for whom they are doing it. I believe so. Yeah. And I think that's where the space is for learning and unlearning, which we should be part of, or we should just be actively listening.
We've had a question from the online audience that I think is relevant here, particularly in that shifting the hearts and minds of folk in the middle, which is, what do you think the role of protest is in this conversation? Feel free, any of you, to jump in.
I might begin by, when I reflect on the disability rights movement, and particularly in Australia, and the US is also a good model for the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement. Many wonderful role models, living and past. It was characterised by, particularly, it was people who were physically disabled who started making the way to protest. So we've all seen the images of them crawling up the steps of Parliament House. And it did have effects. We started to see change. We started to see the implementation or the act of the Disability Discrimination Act. And what's been really fascinating now is to see the wave now of people with intellectual disabilities. I mean, they were the ones who were perhaps marginalised and they were still stuck in group homes and in institutions in the 80s, while those with physical disabilities were out there protesting. So protesters did play an important role. So now what we're seeing is a growing awareness, or you could almost describe them a different cohort within the disability community, and it's wonderful to see the rise of people with intellectual disability. We're seeing more easy read, we're seeing them involved in governance. We've still got a lot more work to do. We're doing it here at the University of New South Wales through the DIIU and the Centre for Intellectual Disability Health. So we are actually, doing it. So it's important to reflect on the wave. And yes, the protests were important then. I don't know how important protests are now, yes, or whether they're even necessary. So I don't have a fixed view, and but I'm just reflecting on the different ways of how we incorporated the different diverse groups within the disability community to see change.
Jackie, any thoughts on the role of protest?
There's a kind of ecosystem, really, of resistance, I guess. Resistance and transformation. Some of that is active out there on the streets stuff. I think that does some things, and it very well, and it does other things not so well. And not everybody can contribute to those sorts of activities either. And that's often the case with people with disability, that for a variety of reasons they're not able to take part in those sorts of activities. There are other ways of, let's say, resisting or changing people's minds, arguing back, perhaps. The danger with something like a large-scale protest is always that you, pardon my language, but you piss people off who are inconvenienced by that protest or what it is. They can't get into work, they can't do this, that or the other. And you lose their sympathy, you lose their allegiance. So there's a difficult balance there. I'm not a natural protester, I'm a more natural writer of letters and so on. I like to think that that's also effective, but it could be just because that's how I best operate. I think one of the best ways of protesting or of resisting is simply being there, being a visible member of that minority, doing something that you might not be expected to be able to do.
We're going to very shortly move to questions from the room. Thinking about that final group, people who are already with us, people who generally align themselves with the movement and the language of diversity and inclusion and DEI, or one of the variations of that acronym, whatever we like to use. What do you think the role of allyship in this conversation is? How would we like to be seeing people working alongside us?
I'll give you an example of where we saw positive change for the deaf community and /hard of hearing community. Was in the 80s, there was a politician in WA, maybe the 90s, I can't remember. So a politician who had a deaf son. And so WA at one point were ahead of providing captions like movies and in schools and what we now see in terms of live caption. So again, for me, it's an example of when you've got somebody in the position or in a position of power or perceived power, and they are experiencing as an ally, right in front of what's happening in front of them, the discrimination their child is experiencing. That's where a lot of the change occurred. But if we sit and wait for every single example like that, we'll probably never ever get to a more inclusive society. So allies for me, allyship, the other success factor I've seen is when you see, in the case of a disabled person, when you talk to your non-disabled peers, when you see them take it up in a respectful and measured way, sometimes you can just step back and let them, without speaking on, for you, raise the issue, particularly if they have access to an environment that you may not have. So, but sometimes that takes years, particularly when you're trying to influence, a collective group of people.
Could we get the microphone down to the front here for our first question? And as you are asking your questions from the room team, if you could just share your name if you feel comfortable, and also let us know if your question is directed to a particular member of the panel or if you'd like it to be open.
Yeah, so earlier this year I was actually approved for NDIS, which was 18-month, deficit-based process and horrible, and you're basically proving you're disabled. And I guess now seeing in the news these children who are being excluded from the scheme, just your thoughts on that in general, and it's just such a horrible process getting onto it. So being on the NDIS can be really beneficial for someone with disabilities, but getting it is a whole nother story. So,
thanks.
Well, firstly, congratulations, and it's a shame once again you've had to go through so many bureaucratic hurdles. When I reflect on what's happening now, if we, for example, reflect on the Health Minister, Mark Butler, when he announced the Thriving Kids program, I think the Thriving Kids program is a good step in the right direction. I think some of the language he used in his address, and I will say this to him, if and when I next see him, was probably a bit unfortunate. And when we talk about those who are somewhat disabled or you're too disabled, the line is ever going to be changing and we will never ever get to where we want to be. So winding it back and reflecting on what the Health Minister I think is trying to achieve with this program, and I've done some work on it through the Grattan Institute, mainstream settings are failing disabled people and we need to make them more inclusive. And then, and I know I talked about where is the line, we still need to focus on the NDIS providing support to those who really need it on a tailored basis. If you have significant support needs that are very, very different from many others, of course, you should be able to get an NDIS package. Many of the things we're trying to achieve, for example, with disabled children, autistic children, children who are non-verbal, I strongly believe can be provided through the mainstream education setting. Not perfect, never will be, but there are many ways you can make mainstream settings. So coming back, Ariella, to your point about having to prove that you're disabled, there are some, I hope, movement afoot to make the application process far less burdensome. Yes, there's just too much red tape, and justifying your disability, I think we've become caught up in the government approach, which is usually quite bureaucratic. So ultimately, it should be a relatively straightforward process to apply for the NDIS and then be able to get your package.
Your question's very timely in amongst all of the announcements that we've had today around the way that eligibility for the scheme is going to be assessed. And I think it's very much to be continued on this question because, since the Royal Commission, since the NDIS review, we've been having so many conversations about the same problems over and over again. And what we really need is the allyship from folk in decision-making positions, from folk who control the money and the supports to kind of be moving this conversation forward because, I hear you, we're having this conversation again and again and disabled people sharing their experiences again and again to so many different outlets and it's not always moving us forward.
I would like to address the title, getting on the agenda, specifically what has happened with the Royal Commission during and since. So what I have observed since the time I think the chair used a very fancy Latin phrase to say, all finished, finitio, officio, on to someone else, you could almost hear an audible sigh of relief for people working in service systems and government agencies that was all over. Many in the disability community were just exhausted by it, but are starting to come out now. And I since have been finding out almost by accident that there's a lot of pockets of government initiatives about implementing the Disability Royal Commission. Finding out by accident, look at who's in the room, and it's flooded with the same people who had the story before the commission started. So pre-consultation, pre-DRC consultation methods leading to pre-DRC outcomes, the same acts of structural violence against people with disability as occurred that needed the commission in the first place. I'm actually finding this deeply insulting to the people who gave their time and stories to the Royal Commission, many who I know have passed. Question is reflections on that prognosis from the panel, and B, is there an imperative and a window of time in which we need to get really shouty and disruptive before all that work has been erased? Marambu.
Jackie, did you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate to voice disappointment about what's happened since the Commission. I'm probably not the right person to make the comments about an Australian Royal Commission because I don't know what the normal state of affairs is in terms of outcomes. The sorts of inquiries that we have had in the UK generally end up with a lot of recommendations and nothing very much happens. So I don't know if it's the case with Australia. The thing I said about an ecosystem earlier is, I think, true that something like a Royal Commission report is not going to achieve what people hope it will achieve or want it to achieve by itself, but it can sometimes, through disappointing people and angering them and outraging them, can achieve the things that we ultimately want to have happen. Sometimes it's by informing the people who will take notice of that. Among non-disabled friends and colleagues, I remember there was a lot of sort of surprise and also interest at the number of recommendations that came out of the Royal Commission, the 222, that are things actually that bad, that you need that number of recommendations? And I was like, yeah, they really aren't that bad. So even at that level, I think it can effect some kind of change. But also, I like a lot of people in this room, I guess, there's a sense of weariness and tiredness of the length of time it is taking, and that I never thought when I was a small deaf child that I would reach the age that I have, with so little having changed fundamentally, alongside some other big changes as well. So that exhaustion that you talk about among people with disability and the organisations is, I think, an unacknowledged factor in the impact that this constant levels of protest and so on that is demanded of us.
I have a lot to say. I'll try to be brief. I share your anger, Scott, and I share your frustration, disappointment. I think the response that we've seen from the government, or government, lukewarm at best, and it's really important, particularly, for me and for, I think, every disabled person who gave their heart and soul into the process. We want to honour the effort that they made. They told their story, they put a lot of time and effort into it, they had great hopes. I can't really go into the internal robust discussion that we had among commissioners. Suffice to say, the disabled, firstly, in terms of the 6 commissioners, there were only 2 disabled commissioners, so arguably we were in the minority, myself and Wanda Galbally. So that's a problem in itself, you would think, from disability leadership, from governing. Having said that, Wanda and I, we knew what the most critical issues were, and then trying to work with other commissioners, some of whom had had very little experience with disabilities. So again, it was a microcosm of what we're trying to achieve in the wider community. So I would love to know what would be the intervention that we need to cut through hearing almost weekly of another death of somebody who had died in a setting such as a hospital or a group home. Jackie talked about the attitude during COVID. Oh, well, they're disabled, would they be better off dead? So, yes, I still struggle. Most importantly, I want to maintain and honour the fact that we've had the highest that you can. You can't go any further than a Royal Commission. So if we can keep reminding the government of that, when, as CJ Craig would say, when they try to distract you, is to come back to the point and say, well, here's the Royal Commission report, here's what disabled people said, can we just focus on that and move forward?
Quick note. I think it's a rage, right? When you are collecting the stories and how do we hold them accountable? I think on one hand, after a point, like with these stories heard and then engaged with, what do we do? How do we hold these institutions and systems accountable is something important. And the question is, what is accountability? But then how do we make sure that they are accountable, right? That kind of a discourse one needs to have. And I think it's like there's a collective rage in this, which I can hear from this, right? But yeah, the discourse needs to move forward with how do we account for them. Yeah.
From your work beyond disability as a context and thinking about, I suppose, epistemic justice at this point, can you unpack that from your work and talk about what it is that drives our ability to value different perspectives and how that might be a pathway forward.
Right. I think one of the questions very often in my own discourse, like in my work, it comes as like how the language of difference is at the heart of like difference is seen as something, again, the language of other, but then you don't want to really hear and listen and acknowledge that. It doesn't come through very often. And then in order to really work through the systems, which is both like, the end goal, like where if you want, the end goal is, let's say, migration health discourse or justice towards migrants and refugees, asylum seekers. It's not enough to just collect stories, because as researchers, we are very good at collecting stories and, we theorize about this. Then how do we hold ourselves accountable in the system? Again, that's something I've been thinking through and questioning. And then working with the communities, because again, I was talking about how do communities already resist and communities already part of the resistance movements, and how do we facilitate as a researcher? And sometimes you don't have to research everything because you know the answer already, like especially when I look at the poverty impact in India discourse, we already know what poverty is, and you don't have to have an RCT, randomized control trial, to prove that poverty exists in order to fix something. Those are some of the questions which I think can, work through. And then again, the stories as a researcher, what do we theorize and what theory is for? Again, that's something as a researcher I come and think through questions, but yeah.
I think also as researchers, you are all excellent at asking lots of questions and then discounting the value or the suggestions that you might have for how we might fix them. I've noticed everyone has said at least at one point in this panel, I don't know how we fix that. And I think that actually we do, and we've been listening to our various communities about it for a long time, and I think the courage in that leadership is really important as well. We've got time for one more question from the group.
Sorry. So my question's a little bit more in relation to kind of the youth aspect. So at least for myself, as someone who's coming into the disability community because of various different reasons, and really hearing a lot of these stories kind of not being personally involved. The Royal Commission was a little bit out of my time frame of advocacy and work in that area. I guess I really want to ask all the panelists, really, in terms of like this future generation of people who do really want to get involved and want to give a level of be able to support the change that is needed. What can we do?
Who wants to kick us off? What can we do? How do we get involved?
Oh, me first?
Go for it.
Look, fantastic question, because, you are the future. You're going to be, part of the generational change we want to see. A couple of things I would say. Personally, I was also an outsider to the deaf community. I was raised in a hearing family, which is quite common, went to a mainstream school predominantly for hearing kids. There were a few deaf kids. I learned sign language properly later in life. And so it took a while, and I realised when I look back, it's a two-way street. I have to trust them and they have to trust me. So trust is probably the first thing I would say. Give yourself the time to be trusted by others and vice versa. The other thing I'm observing, and I mentioned earlier about the different waves of movement within the disability community, there will always be an evolution of some form, whether it's on language, it will pride, I'm not disabled, give yourself time to reflect on what are the barriers you are experiencing, but fundamentally, do what you can to understand the history of why did we fight so hard for the convention? It was because of the history of segregation and exclusion. So that would be my advice. On a personal level, give yourself time, and then also one of the most valuable things for me is forming trusted relationships that I've managed to hold through, and they've been beneficial over time, whether it's ministers or CEOs in the corporate sector, or many friends in the NGO, and of course meeting people like yourself and learning from what you want to do.
Jackie.
I suppose very very similarly, to listen and to become familiar with that community or those communities, and for them to be familiar with you, but not to be too timid. I work and encounter people who are constantly worried about using the wrong language or the wrong word or saying the wrong thing or asking the wrong question about disability. And there's a TV show in Australia, I think, called something like You Can't Ask That. And there was one that was about disability. And that was actually very refreshing. So you can ask those questions that are sometimes very, just very, very obvious to the person with the impairment, but maybe not to people outside. Obviously not doing it in a rude or crass way, but I wouldn't want people with disability to be treated as somehow sort of fragile and delicate and unable to be probed a little bit about their experiences and their opinions. And people with disability are not all, wonderful and angels, and some of them are just bad-tempered people, but you can deal with that.
Before I pass to Supriya to talk about it from an allyship perspective, my own unrequested advice is around disability mentorship and leadership, and for folks who are becoming emerging leaders in the disability advocacy community like yourself, just like Alistair was talking about, reflecting on the experiences of those who've come before, reflecting on the fact that, as Scott was talking about, a lot of us have gotten very tired very quickly, and whilst a lot of disability advocacy feels like a hurry up and wait kind of experience, the work and the progress that you make step by step is important, and not to get disheartened by progress that might feel slower. Particularly as young people, we're very impatient and we want things to be better, faster. But there are folks who've been doing this for a very long time, and they understand the systems, and learning from our disability elders is really important. Supriya, do you have any reflections on the allyship context here for folk in the room who are not from the disability community, who don't work in this space? How do you approach this question?
Right. I think for me, over the years, in different spaces, at the receiving end of allyship, or I'm part of the joining, it depends on where I move and which group I belong to or not in different ways. And for me, the first step, over the last few years, I'm back to working with my own communities back in India. So my dad is from Hill Tribe community. So again, I'm an insider and outsider in different ways. And I think it goes with every other community where I work with, whether it's migration communities or indigenous communities or refugee communities. So I'm an ally in different ways and not necessarily always. Okay. So for me, the big thing is just, as you said, I think when Jackie was talking about just listening and also to learn. But also there's a moment of unlearning needs to happen a lot. And I think I would say that's my journey has always been of unlearning and relearning. It's back and forth, and I think that's something which I need to sit with, and it's very often it comes with discomfort in different places. Like when I move into the refugee community, sometimes I am a facilitator, and then sometimes I'm just an observer. And then sometimes I'm not easily, I'm very uncomfortable being just an observer, because I feel like, what am I observing? Why am I here? I shouldn't be here, that kind of thing. But then sometimes, actually, they are amazingly the agents. All the different communities are agents, like political agents, right? It's not like I'm a savior. Nowhere I'm a savior. I think again, this is a discourse within the global health conversations or in bioethics. Some of the times we come with the idea of we are saviors. Or the idea that we are going to rescue, or the language of brown saviors or black saviors or white saviors. I think that's something which needs to be unlearned a lot. And I think that's something which is a journey in itself. And for my own students, when I teach, or when I teach public health ethics, the first thing is how do we do reflective practice and think about power and privilege both in oneself, and how do we engage within different spaces is important. I think that's something which I keep practicing, and sometimes I do it very badly too.
Jackie?
I think I have actually remembered what it was. It's things go in waves, and I guarantee if you are working as an activist or advocate or an ally long enough, you'll see times when there appears to be enormous progress, and other times when it seems like the absolute best you could hope for is not to go back too much. And I think we're in one of those phases at the moment. Hopefully that pattern continues in that this phase will pass and we will move on to something else. But one of the wisest things that disability activists said to me many, many years ago was that you can't always predict the final outcome of any apparent gain or apparent loss. So you just have to hope, keep doing what you're doing and hope that what you're doing will move things in the right direction. It means you don't get too overjoyed at the wins, but also you don't get too downcast by the losses, because you can't always predict what the long-term outcome of something is going to be. And that helps, I think, with this sort of consistency of movement and resistance.
Can we have a big round of applause for our panel?
Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been fantastic. It's certainly been a really big learning experience for me, and I hope you go away interested, perhaps encouraged to continue the fight for the next however long it's going to take.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode. I hope you found it interesting and that it raised something new or provocative for you. If it has sparked ideas or actions that you want to take, I'm going to ask you to take out your phone or your notepad and ask you to make a note of it now. You can check out the show notes for links to the speakers and panelists from this episode, as well as the DIIU and their work. A big thank you again to the Disability Innovation Institute of UNSW for having me and allowing me to bring this important conversation to a wider audience. If you believe Australian universities can do better, I want to hear from you. Head to higherhopespod.com or follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram. And if you're keen to back this project, please head over to Higher Hopes by Ebe Ganon on Substack, which you can find via higherhopes.com. Until next time, keep dreaming bigger, keep building better, and stay hopeful. The Higher Hopes podcast is produced on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people listening today. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this acknowledgement extends to wherever you are listening from. I encourage you to learn about the traditional custodians of your own country. It's our job to support First Nations perspectives and knowledge in the higher education sector, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the original teachers, learners, and researchers on this land.